Young adult, or YA, is a term for books which encompass a wide range of genres, with everything from dystopian to romance to paranormal. It started as a targeted demographic by publishing companies and quickly became a critical darling which evolved into a genre. And I use this term loosely, with its own set of expectations, tropes, and character archetypes. Some of the best-known YA novels became widely popular films, Harry Potter and Hunger Games being the biggest franchises. In 2005, author James Patterson, known for his Alex Cross crime novels, released the opener in his first young adult series. Maximum Ride: The Angel Experiment was to serve as the first book in a trilogy called The Fugitives, centered around the titular Max and her flock of genetically altered half-bird, half-human kids as they evaded capture by evil scientists while Max attempted to save the world. The books quickly became a smash hit among young readers, especially those in middle school at the time. They were well reviewed and continued past the original Promised trilogy. The series officially ended in 2015 with the release of the ninth and final book, Maximum Ride Forever. It spawned a manga adaptation, a Marvel-produced comic series, a spin-off, and even a film produced by YouTube creator Jenna Marbles. I'm going to be upfront before I get into this. I was in the Maximum Ride fandom. I religiously read these books from 2009, when Max hit the shelves, until 2012, just after then finale Nevermore was released. I was a depressed, closeted 12-year-old, and these books meant the absolute world to me. It was the first time I got involved in fandom, the first time I read and wrote fic, the first time I looked for fan art, and the first time I followed a series until its supposed end. And I saw how quickly that love turned into disgust. I watched in real time as James Patterson went from being a respected author to the bane of fans' existence. The books went from beloved to reviled, targets of scorn from critics and fans alike. Fans left in droves following the final few books. It's largely been reduced to a cringe phase people don't like to talk about because it dredges up memories of that lingering disappointment. Trust me, I was one of them. Also, I want to point out there's nothing wrong with things people label as cringe, but I'll touch more on that later. But what happened? How did such a beloved series, one of the most popular YA franchises of the late 2000s, squander the goodwill of the fans to the point where it's hardly talked about? How did Patterson go from being a literary genius to the target of fans' mockery? And more importantly, why did it happen so suddenly? If we want to dive into Maximum Ride, we first have to talk a little bit about its predecessors. When the Wind Blows was published in 1998, and its sequel, The Lake House, followed up in 2003. They follow Dr. Franny O'Neill, a veterinarian, as she meets FBI agent Kit Harrison after they've both lost their spouses. They find a group of genetically altered bird children and attempt to keep them safe from evil scientists who want to experiment on them. And to be clear, these weren't YA novels in the slightest. They were written with Patterson's original audience in mind, adults. As such, they focus on the adults of the series, their characterization, as well as the mystery suspense element Patterson was otherwise known for. I won't waste time getting into the meat of these novels, and the two main characters, Franny and Kit, aren't important to the larger story of how these books fit into the later series. But there are a few key points which are worth mentioning if we're going to be talking about Maximum Ride. 1. The flock and their personalities are largely equivalent across both series. The leader is called Max, and in this version, she has a younger brother named Matthew. Other members of this flock include second oldest Ozymandias, he'll be important in a minute, Icarus, and twins Peter and Wendy. However, all of them are much younger than their later counterparts. 2. They are genetically altered half-bird children who escaped from a research facility called the School. The School wants them back and is willing to kill anyone and everyone to do it. 3. In the sequel, The Lake House, Max and Oz have a relationship, and, most importantly, Oz dies at the end of the book before Max gives birth to their children. Remember when I said Oz was important? Yeah, this is why. Keep the fact that he dies in this version in mind for later. 4. The kids desperately want to find their birth families, and in the sequel, their families are revealed to not give two shits about them. No, literally, the plot of the second book is the custody battle Franny and Kit go through to get them back. I'm not kidding. These four cornerstone ideas became the basis for the later Maximum Ride series. A few other elements got lifted from these books, but they're fairly minor and aren't as important as these four. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about The Fugitives. The original trilogy, The Fugitives, consisted of 3 books: The Angel Experiment, School's Out Forever, and Saving the World in Other Extreme Sports. Yeah, that last one's a mouthful. The flock of this series also consists of 6 members: Maximum Max Ride, whose equivalent is obvious, Fang, the equivalent of Oz, Iggy, Icarus's counterpart and also blind like him, Nudge, and siblings Gazzy and Angel, analogous to Peter and Wendy. Prior to the events of the first book, they were broken out of a research facility called the School by Jeb, a former scientist, who are called Whitecoats. They've been living peacefully in the mountains of Colorado since then. Jeb disappeared before the events of the books, and the flock assumes he's dead. They have no idea who their parents are or why they were raised at the school. The Angel Experiment opens with the youngest, Telepath Angel, getting kidnapped by the school's half-wolf erasers, one of whom is Jeb's son, Ari. Max and the flock have to get her back, and their home is destroyed so they no longer have their safe house to protect them. Along the way, Max saves Ella, the daughter of veterinarian Dr. Valencia Martinez, her When the Wind Blows counterpart being Franny. Once they get to the school, it's revealed Jeb is alive, and he tells Max it's her destiny to, quote, save the world. They break out and fly to New York City, where they get up to a bunch of trouble which isn't really plot relevant. Max starts to hear a voice, who keeps hammering on that she needs to save the world. Yeah, she starts hearing a voice. More on that later. They find another facility called the Institute, which has files on them and their origins. When they try to escape the Institute, Max accidentally kills Ari. They also find a talking dog named Total, but that's not the point. But at the end, they decide to follow up on the leads given by the files and hope to find their birth families. So some of the big questions set up in this book. Why did they kidnap Angel? Who are the flock's parents? Who is Max's voice and what do they want? I also need to preface this point by telling you that the book specifically denies the voice has any relation to Angel's telepathic abilities. Keep this in mind for later. What's the deal between Max and Fang? Is Jeb really the bad guy? And most importantly, what horror does Max need to save the world from? The mystery behind all these questions was the driving force of the book, and we're left to assume that the next 2 books will answer these. Again, pretty similar to the original novels, nothing too wild. School's Out Forever takes the flock to Virginia. Fang gets injured by a resurrected Ari, and they get adopted by a former FBI agent named Ann Walker, who's a reference to the FBI agent Kit from When the Wind Blows, but not a direct counterpart. She enrolls them in a local private school, and things seem to be going okay. Max and Fang both have minor romances with other students, but both are jealous of each other's dates. They try to find Fang's parents, but that goes wrong, so they never actually find them. But they do find Iggy's family, and he leaves the flock. The private school gets attacked, Anne is revealed to be the leader of the school, her title being the director, and Iggy reunites with them after his parents are dicks. They go to Florida and find out the school is run by a company called iTex. Max gets kidnapped and replaced with her clone, but the flock figures it out and frees her. So here's where we get some answers. We know who runs the school, director Ann Walker, and who the school's parent company is. We at least know who Iggy's parents are, and we also see a reference to the lake house when Iggy's parents use him. We also start to see the development of a relationship between Max and Fang, but nothing is set in stone in that regard. In general, this book tries to build on the questions posed in Angel Experiment to some degree of success. Saving the World and Other Extreme Sports is the final book in the trilogy. The flock gets captured by erasers because Angel betrayed them, except Max and Fang escape. They make it back to Dr. Martinez, and Fang attempts to get Max to give up running from the school. Keep in mind, the flock is still captured at this point. Jesus, dude. Max loses use of her hand after Dr. Martinez removes a tracking chip the school placed there. It's also heavily implied that Dr. Martinez worked for the school at some point. They also get captured and brought back to the school, where Jeb says everything wasn't real and just a simulation. Oh yeah, and Max has use of her hand back to prove his point. Angel is a double agent and reveals that no, it was all real and not a simulation. They break out and take Ari with them, but this makes Fang angry, so he, Iggy, and Ghazi split. The girls and Ari go to Europe to find the ITEX headquarters. They get captured in Germany and are taken to heavily implied concentration camp for mutants. Jesus fucking Christ. Oh, and also Max's clone from the last book is there. Fang and the boys are also doing stuff. Fang uses his blog to incite the proletariat youth into direct action, and they storm the gates of the Bastille in Fang's name. So he asked his blog fangirls for help because he's pretty useless, and they break some windows or something. Smells like teen spirit to me. Back in Germany, the leader of ITEX reveals she's Max's mom. Jeb, who's also there for some reason, says that he's Max's dad and also the voice. Keep that he reveals this in mind for later. But wait, Dr. Martinez is actually Max's mom, not ITEX lady. Then there's a fight, and Ari bites it. Max and the girls reunite with Fang and the boys, and they reunite with Dr. Martinez. Okay, so I'm going to be generous here. Saving the world does reveal at least one mystery, and that's Max's parents. As super fucking convenient as it is to make her mom the lady she coincidentally ran into in book 1 and makes no secret of admiring as a mother figure, it's a nice bit of fan service. It also adds to the dynamic between Max and Jeb, since Max still has obvious hurt from his disappearance and betrayal. But the third book also shows what was going to be an ongoing issue with Patterson's writing. Things just don't matter. Stakes get raised and reversed almost immediately, with little to no consequence down the line. Angel's a bad guy, but then she isn't. Max loses use of her arm, but then she doesn't, and she's fine. Everything up to this point was a lie created in a simulation, but no, it's not, because the dog still exists. ITEX lady reveals she's Max's mom, and the literal next fucking scene is Jeb reversing that. It's hard to tell what is and isn't important, what is and isn't a lie created in service of plot twists. And that makes everything going forward difficult to take seriously, because then fans expect some sort of twist which will reverse it. There's one example which I feel encapsulates this entire issue very clearly. A super important concept was introduced in this book: expiration dates. Ari reveals to Max that once mutants reach a certain age, a barcode date appears on the back of their neck, and the mutant dies shortly afterward. For the next few books, Max continually checks for one. It's a source of genuine fear and anxiety for her and the flock, and then the concept is just dropped by book 6. The flock never have them. The only named mutant who does is Ari, and it's a scare that holds no meaning later on. And Max still hasn't saved the fucking world. We still don't know what she needs to save it from. Was it the school? Was it ITEX? What was it? You can't include it in the title and not do it. The reason the 4th novel is getting its own section is because this is where things start to get interesting. Like, Saving the World had some pretty dumb plot points, but it paled in comparison to what came next. I actually had to go back and reread the synopsis for Final Warning because it's such a forgettable entry in the series. At the time of the release, it was considered to be the worst book in the series, only to be outdone by later entries. But we'll get to that. The Final Warning was the first book in the second arc, The Protectors. Yeah, they're called arcs now. So think of the fugitives as Naruto and the protectors as Shippuden. The flock is summoned by the government, who have no idea how to handle these new mutants. But the flock goes back to Dr. Martinez's place, and Max and Fang's relationship starts to become more apparent. Except Max doesn't want to show her feelings, so the two become distant. The flock is brought along on a scientific mission to Antarctica. The only important new characters here is Dr. Bridget Dwyer, who apparently has feelings for Fang and vice versa. This lady is 21 flirting with a 14-year-old. What the fuck, dude? They go to collect data on climate change, and some of the flock develop new powers, which are pretty fucking meaningless. Wow, Iggy feels colors now. Good for you, dude. One of the scientists is revealed to be a robotic imposter. Angel and Total get lost in a snowstorm, and the flock gets captured. Again. They get brought to an abandoned skyscraper in Florida, and they meet the new bad guy, a robot named the Uber Director. I'd ask who the fuck keeps naming these bad guys, but we know. They manage to escape when the building gets wrecked by a hurricane. The flock goes public in the epilogue. So, if that sounds like a lot, well, that's because it is. And I'm going to be generous with James Patterson. He absolutely wrote himself into a corner following Saving the World. When the flock no longer has to worry about the school, then what do they have to fear? There has to be a big bad, someone or something who stands in the way of the flock's mission. Unless there's something super concrete to ground it, it just sounds like unrelated gibberish, which the final warning absolutely is. When the fourth book came out, people began noticing something wasn't quite right. The plot was messy beyond comprehension, characterizations were slipping, and something in the writing style had changed. And I'll point it out now, but this book absolutely caused some people to drop the series. But those who stayed began whispering about a supposed reason for the changes. It's now well known that a lot of these New York Times best-selling writers who put out multiple books in a year use an unscrupulous method common in big-name publishing. I'm of course referring to ghostwriters. Writing a book takes a lot of time and effort, and when you're putting out 3-4 books in a year like Patterson was at the time, it becomes difficult to keep up with the workload. So publishers hire ghostwriters under the table to handle the heavy lifting. They get paid, but no credit on the front cover. The honor belongs solely to the author. And this practice, in my opinion, is shady as fuck. Like, how screwed up is it for young writers who just want to get paid doing what they love to get saddled with writing a series for big-name authors who couldn't give two shits about what the plot ends up being? And then getting no credit at all and not being allowed to talk about it? Getting paid pennies to be contract pawns for multi-million-dollar corporations and authors who get all the royalties off their work? Talk about screwed up. But I digress. At the time a final warning was published, it was considered in poor taste to accuse authors of using ghostwriters. And in the case of Patterson, people just didn't want to believe it. How could anyone but Patterson be responsible for a series which meant so much to its fans? Why would he allow just anyone to write the characters of his best-selling YA series? But the rumors nonetheless circulated amongst the community, and many urged caution. Wait until the next book. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe Patterson hit a rough patch and needed to find something that could anchor Maximum Ride's plot going forward. It put a lot of optimism in fans who had already given so much time and effort to these books. Their optimism was, unfortunately, misplaced. Max was the next in the series, and the first novel named after a character. The flock has teamed up with Dr. Martinez to work with her organization, Coalition to Stop the Madness, called CSM, which she created with the help of in-universe Jeff Bezos, Nino Pierpont. They do some air shows to bring attention to climate change and almost get assassinated a couple of times. The flock finds out the assassins are working for a guy named Mr. Shu, the CEO of Shu Corporation. And I'm not going to unpack the implications of this. I am not getting paid enough or at all for this. The flock then goes to a safe house with Dr. Martinez, but it gets attacked and Dr. Martinez gets kidnapped. Nudge is like, fuck this, and decides to attend a school, no, not that one, and she leaves the flock. The flock goes to Hawaii, and the Navy makes them do a boot camp before they can help find Dr. Martinez. Also, Bridget Dwyer is there for some reason. Max and Fang go on a date, they get attacked, and the flock is good to go on the mission. Also, Nudge comes back. They find out Mr. Shu is dumping radioactive material and killing fish. Max, Fang, and Angel have gills, and they find out Dr. Martinez is being held in an underwater base. Max and Angel get help from some mutated snakes called the Krelp, and then they rescue Dr. Martinez, and Max and Fang are official now. Like, it's not as bad as the final warning. There's at least a bad guy who is actively attempting to kill the flock, and he's also bad for the environment, which I guess is the flock's mission now. His motivations are not touched on, and we're sort of left to assume that he'll be the flock's new nemesis. This will become increasingly stupid later on. Basically, the whole point of this book is to get Max and Fang together. Nothing really pushes them into that decision. They're just like, oh, we're a thing now. And I'm really hesitant to hate on this entry because it used to be a personal favorite of mine, but just, yeah, it's a lot. Oh boy, now I get to tell you about the shit show that was Fang. So the flock is in Africa helping on a humanitarian mission. When they get there, Angel starts acting weird and tells Fang he'll be the first to die. You forgot about Oz dying in Lake House, didn't you? Max understandably freaks out over this. The next day, a scientist named Dr. Hans Guntherhagen, yes, this is a mouthful, a former ITEX employee, and so I guess the ramifications of ITEX tanking in Book 3 are relevant now, shows up and he has a new boy toy for Max. His name is Dylan, and he's a bird kid just like them. He was created to be Max's perfect other half, and together they're going to reshape human evolution. Please ignore any connotations to eugenics. Max says fuck that, and apparently sees Mr. Shu at the camp, so they leave. The flock returns to the safe house from Book 1, yeah, the same one that blew up, and Max is like, wait, we need to learn things, let's do homeschooling. They fuck around for a bit, Jeb brings Dylan to the house, Max is mean to Dylan, and the flock kicks Max and Fang out because they're apparently too much, and they make Angel the new leader. Max and Fang go to Vegas, while the flock goes to LA. Angel wakes up and chooses violence, shooting Jeb in a restaurant after the patrons drink water tainted with a mixture which will make them mutants. Max forgives Jeb for abandoning them while he's in the hospital, and Fang leaves. He goes to meet Dr. Hans and Angel, and he gets captured, tortured, and killed. The flock finds him, and Max resurrects him with an adrenaline shot. In the epilogue, Fang leaves the flock for good and promises Max they'll meet again in 20 years. Yikes. So, this book is obviously trying to capitalize on Oz's death in the lake house. It was pretty obvious to old fans when the first 6 chapters were released as part of Fang's marketing campaign that this was Patterson's end goal. At that point, there were basically 2 possibilities as fans saw it. One, that Fang dies by the end of the novel, if not the end of the series, and stays true to the series' roots. And 2, that Fang dies and gets revived somehow. The second one turned out to be true, but honestly, this was so much stupider than any of the what-if fics could possibly imagine. We're introduced to Dylan in this book, and it's clear Patterson is offering him as an alternative to Fang in the event that he bites it. He's meant to represent a larger possibility and shift in the flock, but something happened when he was first introduced that I don't think Patterson had truly prepared for. Fans hated him. They hated him in a way that is incredibly hard to understate. They hated him so much, the prevailing fan theory was that he was a traitor or evil in a larger capacity, a villain or the villain. Ship wars weren't incredibly common since the fan favorite was Fang Max and other ships just didn't have the in-canon clout. But Dylan did something other fandoms could only dream of. He united all the ships against him. Fang Max, Max Iggy, even the small number of Max Nudge Fenslash shippers were leaders in the campaign. Posting Dylan Max was almost a surefire way to get flamed because people hated it so much. You can find fan art of any ship for this series, but you'd be hard-pressed to find even 10 for Dylan. This book, like The Final Warning, also saw a number of community members leave. People had optimism when the first 6 chapters were released, but the whole book was a mess of even greater proportions than the 4th. Fang represented the end of Maximum Ride's domination as a fandom, and only more would leave from there. The end was indeed nigh. The 7th book, Angel, begins with Max being depressed that Fang left. Oh, and Iggy and Ella got together off screen, don't worry about it. Dylan is still trying to get with her, and she fights him. Dr. Hans and Jeb are like, Max, you have to procreate with this guy, the future depends on it. Just when you thought Jeb was cool after making amends with Max in the last book. Dr. Martinez tells them to fuck off. Meanwhile, Fang assembles his team. There's Ratchet, who has heightened senses, Star, who has super speed, Kate, who's super strong, Holden Squibb, a self-healer, and Max's clone, who now goes by Maya. You forgot about Max's clone, didn't you? Don't worry, everyone did. Max and the flock go to visit a mutant school, but their plane gets destroyed and Dr. Hans goes missing. They go back, but Dr. Martinez, Iggy, and Ella are all acting funny and talking about a new group called the Doomsday Group, who have nothing to do with iTex or the school or Shoe Corporation, apparently. What the fuck? Dr. Martinez, Jeb, and Ella all go missing. Fang asks the flock to meet up so they can share info about the Doomsday Group, but Max is understandably pissed about Fang leaving and taking her clone along with him. Both groups go to Paris, where the Doomsday Group is having a rally. During the rally, Gazzy, Fang, and Angel have to prevent bombs from going off while Max fights the leader named Mark. But the bombs go off and Angel goes missing. In the epilogue, she's been captured by mysterious forces. Oof. Sorry, that's all I got. Okay, so I'm bundling these 3 together in all their shitty glory because we need to talk about YA, specifically those tropes and expectations I mentioned earlier. YA is a genre which is widely known for a couple of big things: savior/chosen one narratives and love triangles. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single YA series without these 2 elements. James Patterson definitely knew these tropes were widely used and extremely popular when well done. It's clear that by the time he, or the ghostwriter, was writing Max, the publisher was looking for the series to start capitalizing on these elements in order to tap into the larger YA market, which was enjoying a boom of big bang proportions around that time. Maximum Ride had already set up its own Chosen One narrative in Book 1, as well as a growing romance between Max and Fang. The only popular element it was missing was the love triangle, but fans didn't want one. They didn't care. There hadn't been a real love triangle during any of the 5 previous books, only minor jealousy, which was okay plot-wise, but nothing which really stood in the way of Max and Fang permanently. And that's all these books are meant to do. They exist solely to canonize the relationship between Max and Fang, only to drive them apart with a weird, contrived love triangle everyone hated. And again, it's really hard to understate just how much fans hated Dylan. He was a paper-thin character at best, made to look like a goody-goody to Fang's very minor dark personality, but who was otherwise a very chill character. There was no reason for Max to choose Dylan over Fang in the vein of Katniss choosing between Peeta and Gale, so Patterson contrived the whole designed as her perfect other half in order to force it. This love triangle was what became the driving force of the series, not the Chosen One narrative. A lot of the reason fans began abandoning the series at this point was because that initial promise Patterson made in Angel Experiment, will Max save the world, still didn't have a clear end goal or obstacle. There was nothing Max had to save the world from. The Uber director was an annoyance, Mr. Shoe had the clout but not the villain presence, the Doomsday Group was half-baked, and Dr. Hans, well, we'll get to him later. But there was no connective tissue between them, and they felt more akin to a monster of the week. This is all to say that by the time Max and the rest came out, YA was a market completely oversaturated with authors trying to make their mark using the same tropes. It was only a matter of time before James Patterson got in on the same devices, even if fans never asked for it. James Patterson announced Nevermore was to be released in 2012, and it was marketed as the final Maximum Ride novel. This book had a lot of ground to cover, but fans who remained after the last 3 entries were generally hopeful their questions would be answered. In the prologue, Angel, still captured, predicts Max's death. Then we open with the flock going to a private school in Oregon bankrolled by Nino Pierpont. A teacher, who is apparently an enemy agent, threatens to kill Max if Dylan doesn't capture Fang. Meanwhile, Fang and the gang are attacked by erasers and an Ari clone. At this point, nothing shocks me. Star and Kate betray them, and Maya dies. Apparently, Fang has a voice now, and it tells him he needs to go back to the flock. But he gets attacked and thrown off a cliff. While this is happening, Angel realizes her vision was about Maya, not Max, and that Jeb and Dr. Martinez are working for the new bad guy, the 99%ers. They clip her wings and blind her during an experiment. Max and Dylan go on a date, but Max freaks out when the others are spying on them and burns down the treehouse. When they get home, Fang is there and he tells them someone on the blog knows where Angel is. They get there and find out Angel isn't really blind and can kind of see. Dylan goes full monkey and rages through the town because Fang and Max are back together, and then he disappears. Jeb and Ari attack the flock, but Dylan kills Ari before they can capture Fang because apparently Fang has the gene for immortality? Dylan tries to kill Fang, but Max stops him and he leaves. Then Dr. Martinez is there. She was brainwashed by Jeb, and Nino Pierpont has an island for mutants, and they're going there. She tells Max that humanity is about to be wiped out by a man-made virus called hate. We're just going to take a quick second to bask in that name. Hate was the real enemy all along, y'all. #love wins. But don't worry, the island is immune. Dylan shows up again, and apparently some shit is going down, so everyone needs to hide in the caves. Iggy, Nudge, and Gazzy hide there with Dr. Martinez and Ella, who apparently was also rescued off screen, but Angel stays with Max and Fang. She reveals that she needs to stay because she's Max's voice, not Jeb like we were previously told. An asteroid hits the Earth and the explosion injures Max, and then there's a giant tsunami that hits the island. In the epilogue, Max reminisces about how she regrets not saving the world and how dying sucks. But there's a second epilogue. Max, Fang, Angel, and Dylan are all alive, and Angel can sense the thoughts of everyone in the caves. Max and Fang kiss, and now it's mutant time, I guess. Okay, I'm gonna give you a list of things that don't matter anymore. The flock's parents, because now everyone on Earth is dead. The reason Angel got kidnapped in book 1, which definitely wasn't to make her the voice originally. Who the voice is, because yes, it's Jeb, no, it's not. The school and their motives, because they don't factor into anything that happens in the end, except maybe Jeb, but not really because he's dead. Question mark? The love triangle that drove the last 3 books, because Dylan is allowed to get away with whatever, and Max ends up with Fang without any reconciliation period, and Max needing to save the world because it's already destroyed and there is no way she was stopping an asteroid. If that island caught you off guard, I need to add an addendum to it. See, there was a bit of a running joke in the series brought by Fang as a joking way to say that Max doesn't owe the world shit, and they should take charge of their own lives and live on a deserted island. Literally, no one thought it was serious, and a few fans even wrote what-if fic that centered around the flock living out a slice-of-life fantasy on a deserted island. The choice Patterson made when making it canon was not well received. Another cop-out I need to mention is the case of Maya. There were theories floating around at the time that bringing her in a book after Dylan was a red herring, because these books focused on choosing your own destiny over what is dictated for you. Some people assumed Maya and Dylan would end up together. I was among them. The assumption was that Dylan would learn to turn his back on his creators the same way Maya did. Their stories had so many good parallels, and it offered the simplest cop out for Max and Fang to be endgame while still being sympathetic to Dylan and Maya. But instead, Patterson went for the shock value kill literally less than a third of the way into Nevermore. And from a personal standpoint, I'll never not be bitter about it. The same goes for the Ari clone working for Jeb. It just totally invalidates any growth that Ari had before his death. Any semblance of theme is abandoned for the sake of stupid twists. Also, if it wasn't obvious that Patterson was definitely using a ghostwriter the last 3 books, then it absolutely is now. There's one thing I haven't really touched on that I feel needs to be mentioned here, and that's the flock's characterizations, specifically Iggy, Nudge, and Gazzy. It doesn't take much to notice that they don't feature in any meaningful way past book 4. Final Warning gave them new powers, but nothing useful like gills. And fans noticed. Iggy is given a romance and Angel, but it feels more like fan service. There had been 2, maybe 3 interactions tops between him and Ella prior to this. It was a popular ship, often paired with Fang Max, but even fans gave them lead up. He makes a passing comment about wanting his sight in book 6, but prior to this point, his blindness had only hindered him in limited circumstances, areas with loud noises, and new environments. There was nothing to earn this shift in his views. Also, he never truly grapples with the weight of his parents being assholes. He just kind of lets it slide, even though finding his parents was supposed to be a huge deal. Gazzy really got shafted in Angel and Nevermore. Angel, his blood-related sister, supposedly died. He barely gets any time to grieve. There was no attempt to reconcile how this might affect his character at any point. Even when they rescue Angel halfway through the book, his reaction is treated as secondary to Max's. Nudge, in my opinion, really got the short end of the stick. She was the member of the flock who wanted to be supposedly normal more than anyone. She was the bubbliest personality, which allowed her to make friends wherever she goes. She goes out of her way to fit in. And this gets reduced to whining or framed as an inconvenience to the flock so often. There was so much room to explore Nudge's trauma as a science experiment, especially considering the connotations of her race. There's no attempt to reconcile how this might affect her, given the history of modern science using black bodies in horrific, dehumanizing experimentation. Patterson just never did that, never gave the larger implications a second thought. Her traumas are brushed off and treated as an annoyance. And these come through in what Patterson does to them at the end of Nevermore. They're in the caves beneath the island, presumed dead. It speaks volumes to how Patterson views these central characters, as expendable, so long as it's in service to the, quote, important members. This book was, for lack of a better word, a complete clusterfuck. The fans who had stuck around for this last hurrah hated the way the book turned out. Many of us who remained quietly slunk away after the book was released, abandoning the community for good. This was the point where I called it quits. The writing was panned by both fans and critics, the plot completely devoid of any connective tissue to make everything matter or answer the lingering questions. The series had ended, not with an explosion, but more akin to a dumpster fire. So that was it, right? The apocalypse happened, Max failed to stop it, and everyone may or may not have died. Nothing left to say. Oh boy, were we all wrong. Patterson wasn't done beating his beloved franchise to death and announced the upcoming release of the final Maximum Ride novel, Maximum Ride Forever, in 2015. People were not very excited. The vast majority of fans had already given up the series after the massive disappointment that was Nevermore, especially because Nevermore had been specifically marketed as the final book. Like, to put it into perspective, I had stopped caring after the previous book, and didn't even know a new one came out until 2 years after it was released. And I, like a lot of people, thought, why? What's the point? The plot goes a little something like this. Max and the flock have survived whatever that mess of an apocalypse was. They're trying to get away from a volcanic explosion, not the island from before, by the way. Also, Iggy, Gazzy, and Nudge are there, and we never find out how they escaped the tunnels. They get away from the lava, but they can't find Dylan. They go looking, but all they find is a shoe, so they hold a shoe funeral. Later that night, Max and Fang hook up, because nothing says romance like the end of the world, am I right? Fang leaves again and to go find some survivors who are still posting on his fucking blog despite the world literally ending. The rest of the flock disperses. Iggy and Gazzy go to Pennsylvania, Angel goes to Russia, and Max and Nudge go back to the island to see if Dr. Martinez and Ella are alive. Surprise, they're not. And we still don't know how everyone else got reunited when they were all in those same caves. Nudge says she wants to stay on the island. Fang gets attacked by seagulls and Star rescues him. Remember Star? Yeah, same girl who betrayed him. She reveals Jeb is bad again. He's working for a big bad named Remedy who's releasing baddies called horsemen to eliminate the flock. Oh, now you lean into the religious symbolism of winged children, Patterson. They find and kill Iggy and Gazzy. Then, while Max is in Seattle, they drown Nudge. Fang comes across Dylan, and some horsemen led by Jeb murk him and rip off a wing. Meanwhile, Angel is gathering an army for unknown reasons. She telepathically communicates with a horseman who killed Fang. Max finds out about all this and goes to reunite with Angel and her new army of mutant children, and Dylan is also there. Turns out Remedy is Dr. Hans from earlier, and he's been the big bad all along. He turned Dylan into a horseman, and now the armies have to duke it out. But wait! The flock's deaths were faked, and they join in. Except Fang, he's really dead. Max and Dylan get into Remedy's bunker and confront Jeb. Star and Kate are there too, I guess. And Kate breaks Jeb's neck. They then find Remedy, who's attached himself to the last nuclear bomb. Max flies into the air with Remedy and reveals she's pregnant with Fang's child, and he tries to kill her, so she drops him after his bomb doesn't go off. Surprise! Fang is in suspended animation with a new biotic wing, and he can be resurrected if Dylan gives his life. Dylan dies, Fang lives, and the flock lives underground now until it's safe. Max gives birth to her daughter, Phoenix, and the book ends with them returning to the surface and teaching her to fly. Oh boy! I won't lie to y'all. I still haven't read Forever. Nothing could convince me to. In the process of making this, I read the plot and literally couldn't help but roll my eyes at some of the things that happen in it. It rehashes a lot of old, repeated plots. Angel is evil but not really. Dylan is an over-emotional fuckboy and is also evil but not really. Old villains come back with no new purpose and a stupid new title, and Fang leaves again and dies again and comes back to life again. Come on, can this dude just pick one already? I'm tired. Also, I'm just angry that Max wasn't the one to kill Jeb. He was a horrible father to her and Ari, so Kate being the one to kill him when Kate never had an emotional stake in it just feels bad. In a series about overcoming abuse, that's low. And a lot of stuff fails to matter in the end. Dr. Martinez and Ella are dead, so they never really mattered, nor did it matter that Max and Fang wanted to find them at the end of Nevermore. Poor Iggy, though. Dylan fucks off, and the love triangle gets dropped, despite it being the prevailing plot of this arc. Most of the flock literally dies, but apparently that was faked, so all those emotional stakes fail to matter. Max doesn't really save the world, but I guess saving it means surviving? Yeah, that's not really clear either. And all of this was stuff Patterson did in previous novels. It's the epitome of all that was wrong with the series, reusing plot lines that should have been laid to rest and important plot points that either fail to matter or are never resolved in a meaningful way. For all intents and purposes, it's a book that shouldn't have existed. Fans didn't want it, critics didn't want it, casual readers didn't want it. And in the case of the fans, the vast majority had thought the series ended with Nevermore. They weren't clamoring for another novel, begging James Patterson to bring it back in any way, shape, or form. They'd moved on with their lives. In my case, I was no longer the impressionable middle schooler I had been. I had graduated high school and was navigating adult life, like a lot of former fans were. We'd moved past Max, even if her journey wasn't supposedly over. But I think the reason this book exists is that Patterson recognized what he failed to do in Nevermore. I think he realized that he didn't give a satisfactory answer to the question, will Max save the world? He still doesn't hear, but he knew that that was literally the driving force of this series, love triangle or no. And failing to answer that question, even poorly like he did, wasn't winning him any favors with fans or critics. He'd failed as an author at the one thing authors are supposed to do, and so another book becomes necessary to fulfill that. But thankfully, we can finally say that this series was over. After 10 long years, I'm sure there was nothing James Patterson had left to say about Max and... There's another one? No. No, no, no. I refuse. As I mentioned earlier, a film based on the Angel Experiment was released for streaming in 2016. This was a year after Maximum Ride Forever had been released, so it's important to point out that a film at that point was going to do very little to regain the former fan base the series had once commanded. Now, Patterson had been promising a movie since 2007, almost a whole last decade before the film was released. Avi Arad of Spider-Man glory was to produce and had planned the first two movies in advance. Columbia Pictures bought the screen rights in 2008, and Catherine Hardwicke, yes, of Twilight fame, was slated for the director's chair. Scripts were written and rewritten at Hardwicke's direction over the course of a few years. It lingered in development hell for ages, and the release first slated for 2011 and then pushed back to 2013. By the end of 2013, however, it looked like the film was never going to get made after the death of one of the screenwriters. And, as one might expect, as hype for the books died, so did hype for any potential film. And just as it seemed that any chance had finally been properly squashed, they released the film. Maximum Ride was universally panned upon its release. Critics hated the messy plot and half-baked characters, and fans, well, to say that fans hated the film is an understatement. The casting, the characterization, the changes to the plot, all of it was subject to the ire of current fans and former fans who'd watched to sate the curiosity of their past selves. I watched the film 2 years after it came out, when it was on Netflix briefly, and the only way I could stomach it was by getting absolutely smashed beforehand. I spent that entire 90-minute runtime horrified and drunkenly cackling at the awful acting and writing in equal measure. And if I can allow myself to tap into that former fan rage for just a few moments to point out my own issues with it, their wings hiding under scars in their back is such a cop-out for the non-existent CGI budget. Whatever the fuck was going on with Max's character was just awful. Their ages were off by so much, and whoever was responsible for casting Fang needed to be fired and paraded through the streets a la Cersei Lannister. Why is he white? Why does he have more lines than Angel? What is this weird pseudo-Oedipus sexual tension with Max? Like, say what you will about the manga, but Fang looks like Fang, albeit a TikTok alt-lesbian version. Your gender presentation, sir. Hand it over. Yeah, it was bad. But for all its faults, I have to give the screenwriters credit here. The Maximum Ride series had a serious pacing problem from the start. See, the books are frequently divided into two parts, often at weird points. Angel Experiment reads like two separate books, with the first half dedicated to Angel's capture and jailbreak, and the second half for their adventures in New York. All the books have this same problem. They aren't nicely divided into ways that make sense, instead Patterson opting to focus on one plot the first half and the second plot in the back half, with the second plot being wildly unimportant usually. And that's a problem if you want to make a big-budget Hollywood film like Patterson originally wanted. Hollywood likes their films to have nice little three-act structures, which can be easily broken down into beats for pitching purposes. The standard script is 100 pages, with Act 1 comprising 25%, Act 2 50%, and Act 3 the final 25%. The beats are similarly parsed out, no matter which narrative model you use. When you look at it this way, through the lens of how Hollywood tells their big budget stories, Maximum Ride was never going to make a good Hollywood production. You'd have to break up the books into multiple films or cut out a lot of plot in order to make it fit the structure Hollywood prefers. This is probably why it wasted in development hell for so long. Even a seasoned team of screenwriters was going to have issues turning this into a script studios felt was worth the inflated budget. And Hollywood has tried this with more than one YA franchise. Some have been successful. Harry Potter, Twilight, and The Hunger Games are the most well known properties to hit screens, but a large number haven't enjoyed the same notoriety. Mortal Instruments, His Dark Materials, Divergent, and Percy Jackson have all had movie franchises which tanked beyond what people could have predicted. They were victims to two forces: the screenwriters having to decide what was and wasn't important to the detriment of future entries, and Hollywood buying up every IP it can in search of the next big thing without taking the time to understand why that IP is special to its fans. Hollywood's IP problem is as old as time. Ever since studios figured out they could adapt books, they've been trying to adapt anything and everything. The IP boom that began in the late 90s, early 2000s with Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter is still ongoing. That's why you have a million Marvel films, a failed Dark Universe, and every film with a wide theatrical release is an IP of some sort and not original work. Maximum Ride was scooped up shortly after Iron Man found critical success and after Twilight had become a cultural darling. So it's not hard to draw a direct line between these films and Columbia Pictures wanting their own cash cow IP. And what better way to get that than by buying the screen rights to what was then one of the most popular and well-reviewed YA series to date, which came with its own prepackaged and devoted fan base. You'd basically be printing money at that point. In the wake of these extreme successes, every studio wanted to get in on the gimmick. Maximum Ride was just a victim of this suddenly lucrative craze. I'm almost glad it didn't get a wide release like The Lightning Thief or Mortal Instruments, so then it wouldn't be ruined on the big screen like these franchises were for their respective fans. Instead, it got a small streaming release with little to no marketing, and it's almost for the best that it happened this way. The Maximum Ride film came and went, with no fanfare to mark that it was ever butchered as badly as it was. Instead, it is the target of former fans' quiet disdain and mockery, relegated to the large pile of things we don't talk about in this series. I've made passing mention of Maximum Ride's fanbase throughout the video, but I want to discuss it more in depth here, because I feel nothing tells the story of this series better than the fans. Maximum Ride enjoyed a long period of success, not just with how many copies it sold, but with how many kids were utterly devoted to this series. To this day, it ranks as the 8th most popular book series on fanfiction.net, which at the time of Maximum Ride's height was the central location for fanfiction. That's ahead of The Hobbit and Chronicles of Narnia, themselves enjoying an increased fan base due to the rumored Hobbit film following Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Disney's Chronicles of Narnia films during the same period. I actually read fan fiction for this series, so I can speak to a lot of popular types. It's hard to tell exactly how many are centered around Fang Max, mostly because of FFN's weird tagging system where only 2 characters are tagged but not denoted as ships. Thank you, AO3's relationship tagging system. How did we ever live without you? But needless to say, it was the most common ship based on how often you'd read it in summaries. This was a common way to denote the ships of the fic prior to AO3's system. Other popular ships included Iggy Ella, Iggy Nudge, Max Iggy, and Fang Iggy, the only slash pairing which had a relative success on FFN. There wasn't a sole type of fic which dominated the forums, quite like Marvel's high school AUs or Supernatural's Omegaverse. Fics where the flock were normal came up fairly often. Back then, crack fics were considered fun and not quote-unquote cringe, so these came up often as well. These often featured ways to annoy the flock, versions where they encountered and killed Twilight characters, and chat room fics. But mostly fics came up which centered around supposed ways in which the series could end. Fics picked up based on where books had left off, depending on which was new to the shelves. The most notable being when Fang was released and fans scrambled to write their own version of Max and Fang reuniting after 20 years. and a lot of fan theories made their way into these what-if fics. These included, but weren't limited to, Nino Pierpont was the real bad guy, Dylan was a traitor, Fang and Max ending up together and having a daughter, and the flock being real angels and leaning heavily into religious iconography. It's not hard to see how some of these made their way into the series. Fics which made Dylan a traitor frequently featured his death by the end of the fic, both of which did happen in Forever, and, of course, Max and Fang having a daughter. But how I look at these, they appear to be a way to appease the fanbase after they'd already expressed their displeasure. DeviantArt was the most popular site to host fan art at the time, not just for Maximum Ride. It wasn't hard to search for the series and get page after page after page of artwork. There were a lot of popular images which made their way through the fanbase, some of which were really amazing. These became iconic images within the community, and it shows how popular the series was amongst fan creators. Another popular medium fans went to was then fledgling site YouTube. Fans edited their own trailers while news for the film was circulating. They were so hopeful and full of optimism from Patterson's promises that they wanted something to hold them over until that first real trailer hit. They used footage from the book trailers, X-Men, and several sci-fi and fantasy films and TV shows. Fan-made trailers were so popular, they were almost the first thing you'd find when you searched Maximum Ride on YouTube. Several web series popped up during this time. Some adapted Angel Experiment, one even made it through the majority of The Fugitives, and others produced single scenes from the books. Fancasts were also a popular outlet. As a side note, I just want to point out that Avan Jogya of Victorious fame was the most popular face claim for Fang during this time. Compare that to, how they actually cast him. Ugh. Other popular video types included theme songs for characters and ships, as well as chat fics and lists for annoying the flock, much like the crack fic types I mentioned earlier. This was all to say that Maximum Ride was a juggernaut for fan content. It actively encouraged engagement and theorizing from its fans. You could interact with Fang's blog on the website, previously under MaximumRide.com, and the now defunct MaxStanWiz. Fans theorized about potential plot lines based on these blog posts. The site allowed fans to gather together to bond over this series and our shared experiences. Compare that to, now. Maximum Ride was the 8th most popular book series on fanfiction.net with 17.2 thousand fics, not including the vast amount which were purged in the early 2010s. On AO3, however, the series has about 340 fics. That wouldn't even crack the top 200 now. And that, to me, speaks of a fanbase which never migrated following the purges on FFN. Most of the best fic got removed. And around the same time AO3 was gaining popularity, in 2013, Nevermore had come out and driven fans away. Nobody took their fic to another site because they stopped caring about the fic for the series. Side note, I was among those who abandoned fics for this series when I moved sites. MaxStanWiz had super strict moderation, and by the time fans got to high school, this moderation was a hassle more than anything. But those two numbers, to me, speak of just how far Maximum Ride fell. People went from raving daily to just never talking about it. People relegated the series to their middle school days, a phase meant to be walked away from and forgotten. That wasn't to say that the fanbase is dead. In the process of searching around for this video, I came across a small but lively community on Tumblr. People still talk about this series, still produced fic, art, and content. I even found a fan-made podcast which produces a bootleg audiobook of the series. The Maximum Ride fandom isn't dead, it's just smaller, more close-knit than it used to be. I barely recognize it as the community I once frequented, but I like it. A lot of these fans are either relatively new or old hat who just want to reclaim something that made them happy. The norms have definitely changed since I left the fandom. Max has been claimed as a lesbian icon, which, mood, as well as claiming other members of the flock as LGBT. People headcanon Fang is autistic, fan artists have gotten better about the likenesses of Nudge, Fang, and Max, and people appreciate Nudge's character a lot more than original fans, and even James Patterson. It's so much more inclusive than it used to be. Fans are also a lot more laissez-faire about hating James Patterson than they were back in the day. Say what you will about Death of the Author, but in this case, it makes me happy that fans have reclaimed the series. Patterson and his ghostwriters made a lot of story decisions that made people angry. And so seeing fans enjoying something this genuinely without a care for the man who created and ruined it makes me hopeful. I'm hopeful because cringe is fucking dead. It's nice to see people enjoying an objectively bad series, embracing its faults, and making content out of it, which they have fun doing. The memes, the new fics, the art, the podcast, it's a little bit of joy I wasn't expecting to find at the end of this. Maximum Ride was once a series with so much potential. The original trilogy promised action and adventure unique to the fledgling YA sphere, with a colorful cast of characters to populate the world. But it fell victim to a number of forces: poor planning, shoddy ghostwriting, an author who fails to recognize when the game is up, and the crushing weight of its own lofty promises. Maximum Ride, once a juggernaut of the early YA community, then slowly faded into nothing more than a memory of those who'd been enamored with the idea of the series rather than what that series was and what it would become. People got tired of broken promises and bad writing and moved on to better fiction. I suppose I'm a little bit more introspective right now because of how long it's been. I was 12 when I started these novels, and I remember for my 14th birthday, I begged my mom for my own copies of The Fugitives. I remember being so excited to be the same age as my favorite character because Max was all I wanted to be: brave, strong, and tough. And at the time, I wasn't those things. I was suffering mental illness in complete silence, and I'd just moved to a new school for the second time in a year following traumatic events in my family. These books were my escape from a supremely fucked up time in my life. I just turned 24. And 10 years on, I guess I wanted to look back on a series which truly did shape me as a person more than any other. What surprised me going into this was how I expected to have a laugh at a subpar YA series I'd been obsessed with as a preteen, but I came out remembering why I loved this series in the first place. I remembered coming home from school every day and logging into FFN or DeviantArt or MaxGenWiz, excited to take part in a community. In trying to find out what happened to this once promising series, I instead stumbled upon a smaller, more inclusive community who reminded me of the joy I'd once experienced. And I'm okay with that. In the end, I think it's much more productive to remember why we loved the things we did rather than tear ourselves down for having ever liked it in the first place. We can be critical of the things we enjoy while being kind to our former selves. Okay, so it's Monday the 21st, and I just got done with the Forever section. I have about 3 more sections left. You'll see down in the little bar. Bit of an update. So, I was looking around the Maximum Ride tag because I was giving myself a bit of a break scrolling through Tumblr. Kind of wanted to see what people were talking about. And I found a post with a screenshot of an announcement that they're doing Hawk 2, the sequel to Hawk. There's going to be another Maximum Ride book, and I don't know how to feel about this. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle it. I feel like I'm going insane. 2020 continues to deliver in ways that I don't expect, nor do I want. So here's where that might stand. Depending on how this video does, and depending on how I feel and my workload for the spring semester, and if you guys engage with this video, then I'm thinking of reading the entire Maximum Ride series for the first time since 2012 or 2013, late 2013 or early 2013, and I will read Forever. I will read the book that I have sworn never to read in my life, and I will read Hawk, and then I will do a review of Hawk. If you guys want that, if you want me to suffer as you have suffered in the years since I left this fandom. So if that sounds like something you want me to put myself through, let me know. Drive up the engagement, and I may or may not be incentivized to do it. So we'll see. But
Hawk 2.